Welcome everybody to the monthly meeting of the New York City Neighborhood Naturalist Group, which is part of the New York City EcoFlora project. My name is Lydia Paradiso, and I'm a doctoral student at the New York Botanical Garden and the graduate fellow working with the New York City EcoFlora project. NYBG created the New York City EcoFlora project back in 2017 with a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The EcoFlora program is a community science project with three main goals: to investigate urban ecosystems and urbanization, to support open source biodiversity data, and to increase understanding and appreciation of plant life. To date, nearly 29,000 observers have made over 800,000 observations of plants and their biotic partners in New York City. You can explore these observations on the project page on iNaturalist, which I'll link along with some other links in just a minute. Each month, we also sponsor an EcoQuest challenge, which encourages New Yorkers to observe a particular species or a group of species and their ecological partners, and to post them on iNaturalist. Every August for the past 5 years, our EcoQuest Monarchs and Milkweeds has explored the relationship between monarch butterflies and milkweed plants, of which there are about 10 species, which occur in New York City. This year, we've expanded the scope of the EcoQuest to also include the oleander aphid, which is a non-native aphid that feeds on the sap of milkweeds and which have now been located. They're now in all 50 states, and their effect on monarch survival is unknown, although there's been both positive and negative effects that have been hypothesized. So part of the goal of this EcoQuest is just to document the occurrences of this insect, to try and give some more data points for future monitoring. So here's some links. We have the first link is to the EcoFlora page on the NYBG website. The second is the iNaturalist project. And the third is the iNaturalist project for the EcoQuest for this month. So before I turn it over to Tomi to introduce tonight's speaker, I want to share another upcoming event that we have this week. So on Thursday, we're going to be hosting our first in-person walk since before COVID at Pugsley Creek Park in the Bronx. This is a 50-acre park that includes urban forest and wetland areas, and as of now, it only has about 200 observations of plants that have been made on iNaturalist, and only one of those has been in the past 2 years. So our goal for this walk is to increase the number of observations and species observed in this park, while also learning about the plants and the kind of overall different kinds of communities that are inside of that park. If you can make it, we hope to see you there. If you can't, don't worry. We'll be hosting more in-person plant walks over the next year throughout the city, with the goal of filling in some gaps in certain areas of the city that are on iNaturalist. Also, if you have any suggestions of certain areas or trip leaders, or you would like to get involved with hosting a plant walk in your neighborhood, or your favorite park, you can send us an email. I'll put our email address here. It's just ecoflora@nybg.org. And when I find the link for the Eventbrite for the walk on Thursday, I'll pop it in there so you can register that way. And so now I'll turn it over to Tomi. You're muted.
Hello, everybody. If you were not here last time, this might be the very first time that you're seeing me here. This is my second seminar. So glad to be here, and I see some people from last time, so welcome back. I'd like to begin here in New York with a land acknowledgement by recognizing the original people of this land, the Lenape, as well as their deep connection to the Lenape-Hoking homeland. As an organization dedicated to advocating for the plant world, we must acknowledge those who are original stewards of the land and believe in the importance of acknowledging the settler colonial genocide perpetrated against this community and the resilience of the Lenape, who still today are continuing to resist erasure. So for our speaker tonight, we have Dr. Kevin Vega. Dr. Vega was born in Bronxville, New York, and lived most of his life in an apartment near White Plains. After studying at Amherst College, Kevin spent some spent the next years in South Africa and Peru studying species interactions and human disturbance and what he thought at the time was real ecology. It wasn't until after he was finishing his master's in Zurich, Switzerland, that he realized he had a limited vision of ecology. It dawned on him that the importance of these questions of human disturbance and ecosystem functions aren't limited to wild spaces left on Earth, but rather are vital to making a wilder Earth through building better cities in which we can both coexist with wild things. His doctoral and postdoctoral work have focused on working with the city to monitor urban green spaces and understand their capacity to promote biodiversity, as well as the ways in which urbanization is affecting our soils. His work has focused on the roles of small informal green spaces rather than headliner parks and forms of greening which can be enjoyed by everybody. He also runs several citizen science projects on wildflowers and urban pollinators to help connect the public to the amazing nature all around them. Also in his free time, he participates in these citizen science projects. And he crafts gin recipes, and he likes to hike in the Alps. His talk tonight will discuss the interplay between human action and biologically driven patterns in urban wildflowers and pollinators in Zurich, Switzerland. And much like the New York City EcoFlora project, Dr. Vega conducted this research using community science. These community-based science projects achieve two things. They reveal the importance of the distribution of small green spaces for supporting wild pollinators, while simultaneously bringing volunteers into dialogue about wildflowers in cities, their pollination, the role of design in ecological connectivity, and the perception of wilderness in the city. So without further ado, Ben.
Okay, let's see. This should work. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Tomi. And thanks to the New York Botanical Gardens and the EcoFlora project for inviting me. It's really honestly an honor to come in and talk here. I mean, I remember going to the Botanical Gardens a lot as a child and trying to do some work there as well later on. And to be able to present some of my work is really, like I said, an honor. And so, yeah, I will be talking today about my work in Zurich, Switzerland. And my work in Zurich, Switzerland is primarily on the green spaces that we find ourselves within the city of Zurich. And I'll give kind of a little background to urban ecology, as well as try to talk a little bit about sort of maybe in a European perspective, which I think might be kind of interesting. My talk is entitled Punching Above Their Weight, the Role of Small Green Spaces for Biodiversity in Cities. And this picture here is of my favorite park within Zurich, the Pfingstweid Park, which has a really wonderful sort of, I mean, you can kind of see like the cranes in the background as an indication of the direction Zurich's heading, but it has a really wonderful combination of like wildflowers and recreational spaces, which I really, really like. So, as I said, people who have heard talks before from urban ecologists, I'm sure, have heard this phrase that, you know, more and more people are living in cities than ever before. Currently, the majority of humanity lives within cities, and it's not just, you know, the population has grown, but rather even as a proportion, more people are choosing to spend their lives within the urbanized spaces. And this has resulted not only in cities which have, you know, sprawled out and grown into the countryside, but also have massively densified, kind of, you know, shown by these two images here of Manhattan and Guangzhou, China. But it's not just these sort of mega cities that we might be used to thinking about that, you know, have felt this not just a strain, but also, you know, the potentials that come with it. I'm going to talk about Switzerland. Now, for including myself, a lot of Americans, we might not know a lot about Switzerland. Switzerland is in the center of Europe. It's in the Alps. It is not Sweden, slightly different. Sweden is in the north. They much colder generally. But Switzerland is here in the center of Europe, mountainous, chocolate, cheese, and you sort of get the idea. And my work was in Zurich, Switzerland, which is sort of in the German-speaking side of Switzerland in the north. It's the largest city within Switzerland, which doesn't mean a lot for in a comparison to, you know, an LA or Manhattan. But for Switzerland, it's the big city. The number of people who, you know, talk to me about how it's too fast and there's so many people and, you know, coming from New York, it's always fun. but so this is the image I think that Zurich does attempt to sort of present. This is sort of how the city looks. This is the old city. The mountains in the distance, the old churches, a very European, high quality of life city with, trees that you can see from the tops of the, very relatively short buildings. But the reality, and this is not even a joke, you simply turn the camera slightly to the right in this picture, and this is the Zurich that actually exists. Zurich has 430,000 inhabitants, small for, worldwide standards, but for Switzerland, that's big. And if you take the entire agglomeration surrounding Zurich, well, then you're up to 1.3 million. And Switzerland only has about 8 million people. And so an eighth of the entire population of Switzerland lives in this agglomeration, a city that has drastically densified, drastically sort of expanded, and it only is now in these last few years starting to slow down the expansion of its city. It's a city that was building up very, very quickly, and as it built up, it was sealing a lot of its surfaces. And so what we ended up with was a country that had a city that had quite a lot of money to spend on things, and a design aesthetic and a design sort of goal that was sort of modernization, sort of like an international city, while still trying to maintain a European look. And I think in some ways, what you end up with are some hiccups. As sort of small as it might seem from New York, the city of Zurich in the center is extremely dense. It's extremely paved over, and its parks, especially in some of the areas, they're in an attempts in like the 90s and the 2000s with architects to design really up and coming amazing parks that would defy sort of the idea of what a park could be. And you end up with spaces that, I mean, from an ecological standpoint, they leave a lot to be desired. Zurich can do better, and I'll get to the ways in which the city is trying to do that now. But looking at this, you have an idea of a ways in which sort of a city that's different than New York still faces a lot of these same kinds of problems. The ways in which we can sort of see how our design affects nature is to study it. And I'm gonna give you guys a little quick history lesson on urban ecology within Europe. Every urban ecologist in Europe knows this story because it's the most sort of famous story of urban ecology in Europe. But when you look at sort of the island of Berlin following the Second World War, where you had a bunch of botanists who were growing up in a city that was isolated, that they couldn't go to the normal places, they couldn't even go to the Alps or the forest where normal botany was done. And so sort of led in a lot of ways by Herbert Suchopf, they studied the rural flora of the wartime, the post-war city. There was a lot of what they would refer to as Brachen. These are sort of wastelands, rural areas that were left over following the war. Professor Suchopf, he really pioneered and pushed for a studying of this and a classification of this and a sort of a breakdown of the vegetation that was occurring in these areas. And I don't want to focus only on him. This was also occurring. Here's an image of London, very similar. This is following the Blitz in some of these areas. You have these areas that were devastated by war, and people, in a lot of ways, unable to sort of leave these areas, that started looking at some of these wastelands, looking at some of these areas within the city, and devoting the sort of modern understandings of ecology to them, studying the ecology of the city itself and the ways in which the plants were growing, the ways in which they were being distributed, and so on. So emerging from this sort of Berlin largely led school of sort of urban ecology came ways of like classifying urban green spaces. They looked for ways in which you could sort of see analogs. So you have forests that look similar to forests, or you have meadow analogs such as parks and old cemeteries in which you can kind of see similar patterns of species composition and assemblages. Then you start looking around the edges of sort of waterways. You look at some more rural areas and you can start to see analogs to floodplains, riverbanks, wetlands. But then there were some other areas that sort of began to defy very easy classifications, largely lumped into sort of wasteland areas. But over time, these sort of definitions began to shift, and there became an understanding of the ways in which these ecosystems were in fact novel. And so just a couple of conceptual graphs here. This one is from Kovarik, who is sort of the protege of Sukop. And here you see sort of like the ways in which we can kind of conceptualize urban nature. You have sort of on the one hand these sort of leftover remnant forests that have been sort of grown up. The city has grown up around them. They've been preserved in some way. There's a large potential for wildness, and when I say wildness here, I mean sort of like experiences of nature in sort of a more of a sort of a wild way, less prescribed, less completely designed. And then moving onwards, you have agrarian landscapes left within cities. Kind of funny for New York, perhaps, but when I was doing my work, sometimes there would be edges of the city that had cows and sheep and stuff like that. This is not so uncommon within sort of urbanized European cities. You have gardens and other types, all the way to sort of what began to be termed novel urban ecosystems. And these are sometimes ruderal, completely wild, and in other cases, they can be designed. And here's another graph here showing ways in which we can see deliberate design in an attempt to like kind of work with and create these novel systems, these novel habitats, such as, for instance, a green roof. One in which perhaps there is some level of design in terms of laying the substrate, some level of design in terms of selecting species, but also allowing natural colonization, the emergence of sort of spontaneous flora within at some level, design space. And so what we see here is sort of a changing of our understanding of urban nature to encompass a much larger variety and not dismissing these sort of wastelands, dismissing these sorts of novel systems as something to be fixed, to be kind of like improved, but rather seeing their value. This is coming from a paper from Kovarik talking about urban wilderness supply, demand, and access. And this on the right just shows the vast variety of different forms that urban nature can take. And part of this, this supply, demand, and access that Kovarik is getting at here is also talking about who has access to these places in nature, who is seeing this nature, who's experiencing this nature, because something that we have come to understand is as people have moved more and more into cities, there has been something that has been lost to some degree. And how often people come in contact with nature, a loss of experience, an extinction of experience, it's sometimes called. Urban nature, whether it takes the form of a remnant forest or more rural, more wild, sort of more leftover wasteland nature, can supply a lot of these things. The question is, who is coming into contact with it, who is seeing it, and what can we do to sort of improve the state of this nature and make it more available, but also provide an ecological sort of ecosystem function. So Matthew Gandy, who did quite a lot of work on sort of he's a British urban ecologist and geographer, talked a lot about sort of Berlin, but in general, he speaks about sort of what they came to start thinking about in sort of more modern European urban ecologies, rather than clearly differentiated vegetation zones as postulated by the pioneers of ecological science, specifically in this case, Sukop. Urban ecologists have now begun to emphasize the city compromises a lattice of micro niches, kind of maybe made evident here on the right from Kovarik's many different types of urban nature, varying by substrate, aspect, time, and other factors. And although he doesn't go into it in this quote, I would suggest that a lot of these other factors come down to design, come down to the ways in which we build the cities. And the ways in which we choose to build our cities can massively affect the types of vegetation that show up, the types of vegetation that are accepted, and the types of vegetation and nature and wilderness that people get to experience. Kind of going back from this like little bit of a history lesson and speaking about Zurich itself, there's sort of two ways in which the design of the city has begun to sort of, or rather it can be encapsulated in affecting the vegetation, and that is sort of top down and bottom up. So from the top down perspective, the city of Zurich has a greening department called Grünstadt Zurich, Green City Zurich. And they had a program that started in 2015 that was called Mehr als Grün, meaning more than green. and their slogan, weniger mähen ist mehr, less mowing is more. And so the entire sort of, it's playful, but the entire sort of concept is that we are going to attempt from the top down, from the city level, to do two major things. One is to restrict maintenance to kind of cleaning things up on the edges, to maybe not mow as frequently, to allow natural processes to take place and for plants to grow, flower, and produce seed and hopefully colonize other areas. And the second aspect of that was a sowing campaign in which they attempted to sort of green areas that otherwise were completely sealed, open up some areas such as tram lines over here, and put down some seed, local seeds of wildflowers in order to increase the biodiversity of these areas and allow them to sort of kind of give them a jump start in a lot of ways. And then afterwards, kind of let nature begin to take its course. The other aspect, the ways in which sort of like the ways in which we're building Earth City affects the vegetation are from the bottom up, and that's from what individuals choose to do. And so this is just a picture on the right there of Maurice Macchi, who was they call him a guerrilla gardener here in Zurich, and he's quite famous as sort of like a anti-establishment movement here of throwing these seed bombs, which you can still purchase in local garden shops, which contain a little block of sort of seeds, and he would just be throwing them into different areas, different public, specifically green spaces that he thought were largely without flowers, largely without life. And at that time, when he was doing this, and this predates Meeresgrün, he was right. You see him now standing next to Alsea rosa, Stockrose in German, these types of very tall flowers, these Alsea, which with these really beautiful flowers, which is sort of his signature flower. And now the area of the city in which he was most prolific, from the city itself, has kind of like integrated this species into their management. It's now become part of the cultural landscape of this area of the city. So, you know, from a rebel in some ways, the city is kind of acquiesced and rather than kind of stomp down on this, has kind of integrated this sort of approach into their entire strategy. And you see him now, a much older man, kind of looking at his handiwork and sort of the legacy of his actions to bring a little bit more wilderness into the city itself. And this side represents also what people are doing themselves, what they're doing in their gardens, what they're putting on their balconies, how they react to coming down a street and seeing some grass that is really tall, actually. You know, it's not a perfect lawn. I mean, as much as people kind of talk about the American lawn, the Swiss also love their perfectly mown lawns. They even sometimes get robots to do it. And so this type of aspect, this cultural side of things coming from the people themselves, is the other side of the coin. So when you take that all together as an ecologist, like, what can you do? Well, in order to get a handle on the ways in which these things might affect things, we need to get data. We need to, we're still creatures of data, and we're still creatures of surveys. And so that is generally how it always begins. You know, from the standpoint of an ecology of cities, to understand the ecology of the city itself, you have to do ecological research. And this started early on in Zurich. In 1905, the Flora of Canton Zurich, one of the first that really took a ruderal, an inventive flora. So like this specifically was looking at these wasteland spaces well before the Berlin sort of school started. There was a start here of looking at these sort of urbanized landscapes and what flowers were growing there, because without that information, we can't possibly try to inform our decision making. But that is not enough. So the ecology of cities on its own cannot stand. In the modern day, we need to understand as actors within the space of an ecology for cities. We need to do ecology for the furthering sort of the betterment and the sort of integration of our research into implementations. Here I am at an urban ecology, kind of like urban agriculture rather, sort of roundtable. This is an excellent example of sort of just like a very sort of direct impact of sort of ecological research in the design space of creating bioswales in order to deal with water penetration. We feed back our research into cities as socio-ecological systems. And so this ecology for cities is the next step that we need to take as researchers. what that comes down to from my side was that I wanted to do a survey of the flora of Zurich, the city itself, specifically looking at public spaces. And I wanted to see the ways in which we can understand the patterns that exist there and feed back that information into the design process itself. And so what you see here is a map of the sort of results of this survey. I went in 7 square kilometers across the entire city of Zurich. There's a map of the city on the left here, on the right, sorry, everything's flipped. You see here the kind of cluster of dots. Each one of those dots represents a single patch that I sampled. I sampled every piece of public green space that I could find that was greater than 1 square meter in these 7 kind of squares that are kind of outlined by these dots. The color of the dots here represent the number of species I found in that patch. I sampled over 2,100 patches across the entire city, ranging from really, really small, sort of what I call a tree disc. These are sort of street trees that are usually sown or allowed for natural colonization of spontaneous flora, to sort of more ruderal edges that have been left sort of unplucked, unmowed, all the way up to sort of large-scale parks and cemeteries and sort of remnant older meadows that exist on the edges of the cities itself. And already you can kind of begin to see a few patterns here. You see some areas of the city at the very center, let's say. 1 second here, I can just... You see right here, the very center of the city, very few species. The color is generally white as opposed to a blue. And if you look at sort of the color of the surrounding area, there's just not a lot of unsealed surface here. Whereas, let's say, as you head up and out of the city to areas out here on the edges, much higher amounts, much more species that are occurring here. And this is an interesting patch here, actually, this square kilometer, because this is a relatively new area that has been largely developed with the Meerausgrün sort of initiative in mind. Large trams that are completely like greened, streets that have been left open on the side. So there's large scale sort of both rural and also sort of designed novel spaces for plants. And you kind of see that in the species richness. And otherwise, the pattern, I mean, is not really the focus of what I'm going to talk about, but you can begin to see some areas that have less or more species. And so, just to get down to sort of the actual bare numbers that I started to look at, what you see here, I generally I generally broke up my patches into large, medium, and small. Large were patches greater than 300 square meters, and so these are largely your parks, your cemeteries, your meadows, and so forth. Mediums were things in between, and the small, which is largely tree discs or other small rural areas, road verges or traffic islands and things like that. What I think is like quite obvious very quickly is when you look at the number of patches, there's quite a disjointed from like the small versus the large. The vast majority, over 80% of the patches within the city were less than 20 square meters in size. The city was overwhelmingly made up of these very small little tiny patches, these dots all across the city. On the other hand, when you look at area over here, you see that the vast majority of the green space, the square meters of actual greenery, were in these large areas. And I will say I needed to see like a flower or some type of sort of flowering vegetation that was occurring within in the area for me to count it. So a complete lawn, a lawn that basically was mowed down to the grass level every single time was not included in this. So these were really focused on areas that were allowed at least sometimes to, even if you allow some level of clover, we would count it. But there were certainly some lawns that we just discounted. So a lot of these are still kind of like partial lawns, but some of them are also parks and cemeteries and things like that. And so what you end up with are very small numbers of very large green spaces, which hold the vast majority of the greenery within a city, whereas the rest of the city are sort of these tiny little islands separated out, made up of like these little rural sides and so forth. So, I mean, like that was like the very first very large sort of result that we saw here for Zurich, the sort of the inequality of this. going further, looking at actually like the species richness, looking at the biodiversity of these areas, you see a pattern that maybe is not so surprising. On average, a large patch had many more species in it than a small patch. And like I said, this isn't very surprising. In fact, this is one of the most sort of baseline rules, so to say, for ecology. It's called the species area relationship. Basically, size does matter when it comes to this. And this is a pattern that's been seen on tide pools, islands, mesas, anywhere where you can kind of have islands, so to say, you find this species area relationship. It's generally shown in order to make it more easy to understand as a logging, which is a trend, like a logarithmic transformation of the numbers. But what you basically come down to is on the x-axis, you see how large the area of the patch is. And on the y-axis, you see how many species this patch had. And as I said, as you might expect, a fairly linear relationship. More species means, more area means more species. There's more areas for them to live within. There's potentially a number of different kind of microhabitats within it. You generally see this all over. And this was the case whether you were in the outside of the city, where there's plenty of other green spaces and forests and so forth, or in the very center of the city and you're sort of an isolated park. The larger your patch, the more species you have. So this was like our second sort of big finding, other than the first one, which is sort of more about the distribution. This showed us that this sort of common rule of biology, even within areas that are sown, even within areas that are cultivated and designed, this baseline of biology, this baseline of ecology still hold very strongly firm. But that's not the entire story of diversity within the city. Here you can see now added to this diversity graph on the bottom are the total species richness. And what this means is the total number of species we found in these areas. I had a list of species that I was looking at, largely native species. It also included some non-natives, but it was created within the first year as I was counting every single species that I had. The first year then created this list, and then I focused on this list for the rest of it. It was 166 species, which I looked at. And what you see here is out of that 166, small patches, despite being a very tiny fraction of the total amount of green space within the city, held within them nearly the same amount of species as the large patches. In fact, out of my list of 166, 98% of them were found within small patches. Now, obviously, this is not in one small patch you're going to find very many species, but rather when taken together, they contain the entire breadth, as much as all of that area of meadows and cemeteries and parks. One way to look at it sort of so what I'm describing here is beta diversity, a diversity of diversities. One way to look at it is, let's say you had 1,000 meters of green space, and in one situation you've broken it up now into 3 large patches. Each one of these sort of yellow shapes represents a different species, and so the abundance is quite high. You have a lot of different species in here, and for each one of these large patches you actually have quite a lot. So let's say in this case, simplified, you have 4 species per patch, but across the entire 1,000 meters, because the composition of the species are quite similar each time, you only have 4 species total. If we instead broke it down by these small patches, let's say each one of these little boxes is a tree disc or a rural area, well, each one of these doesn't have that many species, and the abundance is actually quite small. But when you take it all together, you end up with many more species. To kind of simplify this look, I made a graph here of cumulative area versus cumulative species diversity. And what that means is I would go through patch by patch, adding in species as I found them. The number on the y-axis will go up every time I found a new species, and the cumulative area will go all the way until I've sampled all of my patches. And so what you begin to see is kind of a somewhat of a linear relationship as I add patches to this analysis, starting from the very largest down to the very smallest, until finally reaching the total number of species, 166 that I found for all of these species, kind of a linear relationship, starting from the largest patch to the smallest. But if we were to flip it, the story begins to change. We start with the small patches first. Very quickly, under much, much smaller amounts of space, comparatively, we reach the same number. And that's because each one of these patches is vastly different from one another. Each one of these patches is in a different habitat, has a different kind of species composition, and despite its small size, actually, for each square meter that it was, had a much higher diversity. And as you add in more patches, doesn't really change. Visually, this looks like basically this. These large patches tended to be these types of meadows, these parks, these cemeteries, like I said, whereas this, you see a huge difference. Large patches tend to be 2 to 3 times more similar to one another than small patches. The beta diversity of these small patches punched largely above their weight. And at the end of the day, if you were saying, I want to have as many species as possible within 1,000 square meters, several small patches numerically would contain a higher number of species than one giant park. Many fewer actually, in this situation, tended to have a higher beta diversity, increase the diversity overall much more. Now, this is not to say that large patches are not important. By far, they contain the highest abundance of them. They are far more resilient to small changes. A single act of mowing cannot get rid of what the species in a large patch is, while a single tree disc is immediately gone. Furthermore, a lot of our most rare species tended to show up only in some of these other areas of like large green spaces. So for conserving species, large green patches within cities are vastly, vastly important. And they need to be like a cornerstone of any sort of conservation effort within a city. But I think for a lot of sort of designers, what kind of threw them for a bit of a loop was how much more important than they thought these small patches were. But not every small patch is made the same. Connectivity played a huge role in this. And this is because, especially once we're talking about spontaneous urban floras, when we're talking about these sort of novel spaces here, pollination, colonization, seed distribution, these play massively important roles. And each of these is limited in a lot of ways by how far apart the patches are from one another. Because for many of these small patches, unlike the large, they are sort of islands within a gray sea. They need this connectivity to function. I created, you don't need to look too much at this sort of equation, but what I did was create a model to sort of explain the connectivity, to create a connectivity number for each one of my patches based upon how many other patches were within this distance. And this distance was calculated by the average dispersal distance of the species that I was looking at. If you were a big patch that was close by, you got a very high number. If you were a small patch that was far away, you got a very small number, basically. So this would show how well connected a single patch was and what effect that might have on its diversity. And this is now a look at the effect of this connectivity, as I said, on this diversity. And once again, I log transformed this in order to create more of a linear relationship to make it easier to see. And what you might begin to see is that I broke it up by the size. So you have large, medium, and small. For large patches, we saw basically no pattern. When you're that big, it doesn't really matter how well connected you are for the species that I was looking at. Likely for more rare species, it's going to be certainly more important, but for the vast majority of species, it didn't matter. You were self-sufficient. For medium patches, these sort of intermediate size patches, it mattered. It was a significant effect. And for small patches, it was very significant effect. Meaning that if you were small, you had the potential, obviously, to have quite a large number of species, but you needed to be well connected. You needed to be close by other patches in order to gain this benefit. So this connectivity, the way in which these green spaces were laid out within the city was very, very important. And to sort of, give a number to this, I looked at sort of comparisons between, to look at sort of autocorrelation between patches to see where these sort of cutoffs were, where I would stop seeing an effect of patches being together. And so when you were very close, less than 10 meters, you were seeing a very, very strong effect. 100 much less, and 200 was basically the cutoff. So what I ended up telling planners was that basically, if you're not having less than 50 is ideal. If you really want to see an effect, this sort of mutual support as they sow seeds to one another, or not rather sow, but distribute seeds to one another, as they pollinate one another and help create sort of networks for pollinators, you need to have them within about 50 meters or so if you want to see a big effect. And if it's past 200, you're basically gone. Like then I basically was seeing no more effect whatsoever. And I'm very happy to say that like already this numbers, at least, which is sometimes you do just need to give numbers to planners, which I mean makes sense. They are not there doing the research. Has already changed some policies in terms of how green spaces are being distributed within Zurich as well as Bern, which was really nice. And as I said, sort of implementation kind of going off and trying to understand the ways in which Zurich was connected. I kind of took a page out of Barcelona, where they have done a wonderful job in networking this, and started looking at sort of like the patterns that we were seeing in the city of Zurich. And this is sort of a zoom in of every single one of my patches. And as you can see, there are some areas which already kind of show like where you might think they are not very well connected. And I brought this to planners, and using these cutoff values, I discussed like where are areas of like concern, and most especially this difference between and the importance of these small patches. Because if we just cut out all the small patches, if we just leave in these large patches, what you are left with is a city that cannot possibly sort of sustain itself on its own. Leaving in just these large areas, none of these really are well connected enough to benefit one another to any significant degree. Looking at the small patches, you begin to see the ways in which these sort of corridors, the ways in which these stepping stones can act to link these places together. And combining sort of these connectivity values with the species diversity, well, I mean, it is no wonder that some of these areas actually have really, really high, sort of above average levels of diversity when they are very well connected, like with not just with small patches, but also with large patches, as you kind of see here in this top right corner. This is once again the one that kind of was started off with Merelskroon. These had substantially higher than average values for a lot of these, and I think it comes down a lot to the design. Because in the end, when you have design that comes in looking at the plants as part of the design, as kind of supporting the natural processes, well, then there's a lot you can do. Whether it's tram lines, light rail that are greened, stepping stones, or the creation of sort of linear parks, there's a lot you can do to help promote the natural, kind of give a boost to the natural abilities of plants to survive, to colonize, and disperse within the city. And by basing sort of my research within these values, looking specifically at dispersal distance to calculate these connectivities, I'm pretty confident in sort of the ways in which I hope they can help define design goals in terms of distances. Moving past this to the next step, I mean, this is all well and good, but at the end of the day, it still comes down to the people that live in cities. Kind of bringing this back to Maurice Machi, these are some of my favorite pictures I took from my research, from my field work. And you see areas here, urban garden that is basically a tree disc, street tree that's been more or less taken over by an individual and turned into a little bit of an urban garden for them. Nicht abschneiden, like please do not cut me, written around them. On the left, you see in French, respect for our garden here, please. You see like places where people have put in bee houses, not bee houses, but wild bee hotels and things on these street trees. These are public spaces. And then at the bottom where one tree was felled in order to make a new an expansion of the train line, you see we're sad over this this dead tree now. We like in memorial of this tree. The people aspect is extremely important for any successful sort of design, for any successful intervention at the of urban ecology. At the people, maybe the Swiss more than all, but I think this is something general. People do like to care and arrange, and they form. There are ways in which we can sort of integrate this into the ways in which we maintain these green spaces. Orderly frames is one way. By kind of like mowing the edges of spaces, you can show that you have a cue to care. We are caring for this green space. We are not just letting it go wild because we're lazy or we don't have the money for it. We are doing this for an intentional reason. And Merelskroon is quite good with that in the sense of providing informational placards generally when they do this. Additionally, mosaic mowing is something that I've seen happen more and more, which I really, really appreciate, which are kind of, sometimes they'll mow around in a kind of a circular. Now, obviously for the biodiversity, the best thing possible would be to hopefully let these plants come to flower, set seed, and so forth, and then especially allow them to overwinter and not cut them all down because a lot of insects like to overwinter in them. But at the end of the day, if you can't force design onto people against their will. They need to be an integral part of it. You need people out there like Maurice Machi to be on your side rather than kind of force your design, because at the end of the day, the people are going to take the desire path. They're going to, you're going to set up a perfect, nice little right angle and they're going to cut right through. If they don't understand why, if they are not informed at all, if they're not brought into the decision-making process, if they're not, engaged as stakeholders. And instead, sometimes I think as urban ecologists and as designers, we need to come down and we need to say, all right, you know what? Permeable pavement across your desire path. We understand why, and we embrace and and we accept that uh, the best case scenario might not always be the most functional, and sometimes you need to work with the people and you need to bring them on board, such that the next design after that maybe can be better. Because they will not only understand it, but they'll have a voice in making that, and they'll have a voice in pushing that forward. And so, as I said, Grünstadt Zurich has done some pretty good work with Maus Grün in putting placards saying, this is why we're doing it. More flowers are going to be growing here because of what we're doing here. Flower power, like this is, we are creating something here intentionally. And I'm going to go a bit more into this in a second. Citizen science is another way to, directly work with the people, to show them what's out there and to hear their own voices and say, this is your city, and we would like to kind of experience this wilderness with you. And lastly, to work also as an urban ecologist directly with designers. And so I was lucky enough to take part in a couple of different runs. This was the most recent right before Corona, really got intense over here with landscape architects and planners, and to present my work and to discuss, like, it is not enough to simply put down these limitations and say this is the way it needs to be because we need to create the most biodiversity possible, but rather these are the ways in which it can also be integrated within your design from sort of a functional standpoint, to create spontaneous flowers that kind of self-assemble. And so to kind of give some examples of this, I'm going to talk about my work with citizen science, which was kind of the tool and the experience. I mean, as a person who volunteers a lot in these, that I really enjoy, and I was really fortunate enough to work with a great group here in Zurich called SWILD. And the very first project we did as part of my doctoral work was called Wo Samen fallen, Where Seeds Fall. And it was a super simple sort of idea. All we did was we supplied them with these boxes. We set up a website where they could upload images of these boxes and what came on like a georeference map. And we just told them, put it outside and water it and see what grows. And people took their photos, they uploaded it. And at first there was a lot of kind of pushback. We just filled it with soil from the local market. So like not compost. Ideally, this soil has been like without seed. So sometimes you find a tomato or something growing there, but most of the time these are plants that are very, you're quite confident have spontaneously come in through the air, or through ants or through other forms of dispersal. And what was remarkable is how quickly the sort of disbelief and the questioning of the people turned to pride as they were uploading their pictures and they were trying to identify which plants were which, and they were sending in images. We had a couple of days where they brought in their boxes, and we had a great, wonderful botanist take a look at them and ID them, and then we turned that into like, okay, let's go around some of your areas and see where in the public space maybe these seeds are coming from, because the number one thing we wanted to do was connect what is happening in your garden is part, like your garden, your balcony, your rooftop sometimes is part of the larger green spaces of the cities. So, the best is when somebody would come down and upload with a comment being like, oh, I found this species down the street in a tree disc, and make this connection that the public greening was in turn affecting what was growing there, and then vice versa, because what they're putting in their garden is just as likely to send out a seed and grow down the street from them as the other way around. And so making this connection and showing the interconnectedness of your public and your private within cities, I thought was a really fun sort of way to go about it. Kind of jumping off of that, we then moved to another project inspired very heavily and kind of integrated on her website of Sophie Legille's More Than Weeds, which I think is an awesome project. She's done it in France, and there's some other other projects in France that are kind of going off this, but also in the UK, which shown here by The Guardian, where people just go out and they write the name of the plant that is spontaneously occurring on the sidewalk, spontaneously occurring in a tree disc or on the side of a road, just to draw awareness to the vast diversity of species that are out there. Because even at the time of Sukop, they were amazed very quickly that more species are occurring in cities than are occurring in sort of the agricultural landscape surrounding them. That cities are actually biodiversity hotspots, and this is not just with sort of neophytes, but sort of like introduced species. Although there certainly are a lot of them there too, and that's sort of another discussion we can have. But even just looking at natives, there are still far more that occur within the city of Zurich than occur within the Zurich agro kind of landscape surrounding it. Due to the ways in which we sort of are growing our food these days. Cities are hotspots, and so this project is kind of drawing that attention sort of virally through that. And so we did that also with Svilt. We had Mehr als Unkraut, the direct translation, more than weeds, where we went out with our group of volunteers and we went down a couple of streets. We gave them chalk and we sent them also home after sort of a walk around this area where we helped identify flowers, and we just drew their names. And so in German, we went and we just went down a few streets and then handed out chalk, and people put in all of these wonderful plants and connected them sometimes to stories. And that's always, to me, the most interesting thing. This plant is edible. This plant has the story of where it got its name through sort of the medieval age or something like this, Compuslatic, compass lettuce, because of the way in which its leaf turns to face the sun. And that's where it gets its name. And so these people, just by drawing attention, and then after you go down the street and you do this, the number of people that just walk by and stop, and for probably the first time in a long time, they look down and they read it, because these are the spaces that people engage with every day. If you can go to a park, if you can go to a wonderful meadow on the side of the city, that's great. That's perfect. I'm very happy that you can do that. And it's wonderful to live in a city where you have that opportunity. You can go to Central Park, but what instead happens for most people is they spend their days walking down streets like this, and what the greenery, what the wilderness they see isn't, Central Park. It's not even sort of Friedhof Sildfeld, the cemetery, but it's a tree disc. It's a rural area. This is the greenery. This is the wilderness that people experience on an everyday in a city. And to draw attention to that and kind of let them see it again, maybe with slightly different eyes, I think was something really special. And we got a little bit of traction within the news. And something that I love, right in the title, in Zurich, over 2,000 plants exist. And I think for a lot of people, that was a massive surprise. The project I'm currently doing is, so this was more of an outreach, and the next one was more of a direct sort of like scientific one, because something that really interests us, after this, a lot of our volunteers really were interested in pollinators. They wanted to do something with bees. And so something that I had in my mind since my work was, okay, so we saw this diversity with plants. We saw the effect of beta diversity, the importance of beta diversity of these small patches. But what does that cascade down? So you have, from, or rather up the trophic level to sort of the pollinators. We know sort of botanically what we might expect in terms of diversity between like the small and the large patches. But what is the effect if we were looking at the diversity of pollinators? And this was the project, we just got recently funded. It's called B cubed, or B3, Bienen, Baumschieben, and Bestäubung, bees, tree discs, and pollination. The 3 B's don't work in English, unfortunately, where we wanted to do this comparison with our volunteers. And so we had, once again, we had a great day outside where we had worked with amazing entomologists, really experts in the field. Our volunteers went and they looked at different bees, wild bees specifically. A real focus is on wild bees for this project, under the microscope, to get an idea, to help try to, get an understanding of like their roles within the city and the vast diversity of wild bees that exist. Because I think for a lot of people, they see, there's a honeybee, which they know, maybe bumblebee. And there's this general idea that these are small flies, that some of them are kind of like baby bees or something like that. And I think the reality is unbelievable. Within a city, there's a huge variety of wild bees, and sometimes they differ from one city to the next, down to that level. There's a huge biodiversity that can occur within cities. These are all pictures taken by our volunteers, and it's just like truly amazing what they've been able to find out there. We would go out there and we've sampled these areas. On the right, you can see sort of the map of Zurich that we have sampled, a lot of them within these squares that I did for my project, but some of them also outside. And we're really trying to draw this contrast between these very large patches and the very small to see if these patterns hold up. And I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I have the impression that they're probably not going to hold up, but that in and of itself is also interesting. Something that we did find already, and unfortunately I have to kind of leave it as a cliffhanger because we're still waiting on the results from this year. I mean, I just went out this morning actually to sample, and that will have to be for another talk. But something that we did see was how much it changes and how much mowing is affecting it. So at the June 17th on the top there, you see it was one of these green roadsides, and there was a huge diversity of bees. By July, they cut the entire street down to nothing. And of course, there's a lot of maintenance reasons why. But what you end up with is taking a place that had a huge diversity of pollination from a lot of flowers, an entire meadow worth of flowers, to none at all. By August, some areas were allowed to grow up a little bit. Some of this mosaic mowing, which is great, cut down once again by September in order to create this sort of like cleared out area. And this was one of the areas that actually is part of this Maralsgrün. So I mean, I think there's still work to be done from the maintenance side of things, and this is coming from the top. And what's remarkable is they go down through an entire area and clear mow like this. And knowing what you do, now that you're going out there and you're seeing it and you're touching these plants, you realize very quickly that, like, wow, we're losing a lot of pollination potential within an entire area almost instantly. It is not like piecemeal, but rather clear. And this is something I want to talk to the city about, because I think our results are going to show that this type of completely clearing out an entire, like, street after street after street in a single area, it definitely affects the local pollinator population. And not only that, even if we don't cut it down, the effect of drought. I mean, we've had some really, really hot summers recently. Last summer, this is 2021, which wasn't even so bad for Zurich. This summer is much worse. I mean, what the plant, we have areas out here now which are just brown and crunchy. This is the reality of climate change. This is the reality of living in a city. And if you have some of these small areas, as much as I hype them up and I think they are wonderful, there's not a lot of resilience when it comes to this, because there's just not a lot of soil. You have small boxes of soil in a lot of these areas, and they cannot handle extreme amounts of heat and lack of rain. And so you end up with crunchy grass that, in the beginning of the season has a lot of pollinators, and by the end is not functional. Just a quick look of what we ended up finding. Something that really stood out to us was, and not surprisingly, the honeybee. Even if you combine, like, barely beaten out, if you combine bumblebees and all the wild bees that we found together, this is just a count. The honeybee was ubiquitous. Zurich has an intense local honey production, or city honey, which is in some level wonderful, but it's the density of these hives are to the point where we've already seen it in some studies coming out of Munich, and Zurich density is even worse. So I think what we're going to see is that they are vastly outcompeting a lot of these wild bee species. And the honeybee, as much as I love honeybees and I think they are very important, they're a domesticated creature. I mean, it's like a cow, in some ways. It's like, you go down the street and it's wonderful that you have some wildlife, but it's a cow, sitting there and pollinating your wildflowers. And the huge diversity of wild bees is taking the hit for that. We found 14 different genera, including several endangered species on the red list, as you see 2 pictures here. It was really kind of a wonderful experience, and people are really, I mean, they're in love with pollinators. They love bees, and I think this has really helped, add on to the plant work that I've done before. So to sort of sum things up, cities are novel ecosystems which require new conservation approaches, a new understanding of sort of design and its way of interacting with spontaneity, sort of designing for the unintentional. Big patches are incredibly important to maintain sort of resilient spaces, and for the conservation of rare species, but small, well-connected patches can hit well above their weight and contain quite a large amount of beta diversity in terms of wildflowers. In order to help support this, we need to sort of work with the city. We need to work with the plants. We need to choose species that work well under this, under these conditions, underneath drought, underneath distance to seed disperse, and we need to sort of help them along, either through sowing of specific species when it makes sense, or through designing our spaces to take advantage of that. And lastly, none of this will matter if we don't engage the public, if we don't bring them in as stakeholders, if we don't inform them and listen to them. None of our actions will actually, work, because people will always need to be on board for any of this to work. And with that, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank, first of all of my support. I've been wonderfully supported here within Switzerland, all of our wonderful volunteers, the SWILD network, the Zurich Zurich Basel Plant Science Center, where I was supported by Stiftung Mercator Schwyz, my work at the ETH, the Participatory Wissenschaft Academy, which supported all the citizen science work, and my work currently looking at soil with the Future Cities Lab. Thank you.
Great. So we can open it up for questions that anybody might have. So if you want to, you can type your questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask Dr. Vega your question yourself. I'll give it a few moments for people to type questions, or unmute yourself. Go ahead.
In the meantime, I have one comment and one question. So this made me think, when you're talking about the kind of interconnectivity, about the emerald necklace in Boston area. So I don't know how the disconnect between the vision and the actual realized system, but yeah, it's interesting that even back in the 1800s, when that was being designed, even though they might not have known the kind of implication of that, but that how to integrate the urban system with this kind of string of green space. And even here, like in the Bronx, I know there's a lot of those kind of, the parks that are along the highway, where it's, not probably really the best space, but at the same time, it's really better than nothing. And you end up with these really large areas of land, even though it's kind of a really narrow strip that provides that kind of good habitat to then kind of connect to another kind of big space. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also think, so like for the emerald necklace, for instance, I mean, even as just from the human-centric side of stuff, as recreation, we also love connectivity. We don't love going for a run and then having to hop across a highway. And so, I think this type of design, I mean, we are also creatures, and we like, continuous green. So this is sort of linear parks, sort of riverine parks along rivers or highways or things like this. Have these sorts of benefit, and I think there are, they can act wonderfully as corridors. I think you see it also sort of like in New York, the ways in which sort of like coyotes end up in places following certain kind of green stretches of these like linear parks and these other type of river connections. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, we got some stuff in the comments in the questions now. Something that was mentioned earlier about permeable pavement, which I was also thinking about, like what is permeable pavement? So when I think of pavement, I think of just like asphalt, which is not permeable. So what are kind of options for that?
Yeah, so permeable pavement, I mean, there's a couple of different sort of like what you call permeable pavement. I mean, at the end of the day, it's basically, I think there's been some very high tech options, which I think I have yet to see one that like I personally have found to be like amazing. I think a lot of times I think a lot of times we have these sort of high tech aspirations for things, the way the technology will sort of like make things perfect, which probably don't really exist. When I say permeable pavement, I mean a lot of times, like, I mean, those were simply like blocks that allow water to go through, or allow green to come through to some degree. Basically, things that prevent water that help support water infiltration is something that I would consider to be like permeable pavement. And then, don't get extremely muddy when a person walks across it, let's say. Yeah. But certainly, I mean, you could look that up. There's like very high tech attempts to build, permeable, you just look at the Sponge City sort of design space within China. There's certainly permeable pavement that has been attempted there. that is like it's super materials or things like that, which I mean, I just haven't seen it kind of implemented in a way that I've absolutely loved yet.
We have a few questions in the chat and a raised hand. So Natalia said, great presentation. And then she is wondering, does Zurich have any problems with heavy metals? Thinking about the honeybees and urban honey production.
So one thing that's Switzerland, so Zurich used to be an industrial city. It was, you know, on the river. Zurich, you end up with now with a lot of these sort of Zurich doesn't do abandoned buildings so much. They have enough money that they quickly like turn these things over. Unlike, say, you know, Berlin or something like that, where you have much more of these sort of rural spaces, these leftover sort of vacant lots and stuff. But nevertheless, the remnants are there. They have a pretty good handle on identifying it. You know, there's great maps which you can download for free of where these areas are. Certainly, there are areas of the riverside in some of these post-industrial spaces that have heavy metal problems. In fact, one of my favorite areas is a wonderful sort of community garden that is built upon what was once a trash heap that is then turned into a stadium, and then they tore down the stadium, and it's now this sort of like abandoned space, which is eventually going to be turned down. They're going to remove the garden, but so far people are fighting to keep it going. But in terms of like actual pollution there, I would not be very surprised if there are some significant heavy metal issues there. But overall, the city has done a very, they have the infrastructure and sort of the means to control from the top to sort of like excavate and remove the most contaminated soils. As far as I understand, that the honeys have tested well enough that they are selling them within the city, and the Swiss are very particular about testing a lot of their products. But I haven't looked in specifically this heavy metal honey issue, but I know for sure it does exist in Zurich, contaminated soils.
And if you're interested to hear more about heavy metal contamination in soils in New York City, we do have a past talk on our YouTube page about that.
Jack wanted to know if there are any guidelines, or if you had any guidelines on diversifying the number of native plants across connected small patches in cities.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think to me, I think something that I've seen has been a very positive influence of, and this is what I'm saying, kind of design for the unintentional, which is kind of a bit of a oxymoron, but if you can create the space to allow natives which can function within the city to grow, then you kind of remove a lot of the barriers that allow them to do so. So there are certain species that are going to do better than others. I started going down this path, and unfortunately my funding ran out, but looking specifically at which species gain the most from being next to other conspecifics, other ones of their species, which ones can actually sort of benefit from that. And there were certain species that seemed very strongly, and it's sort of ones that you might expect, that are able to disperse their seeds quite decently and kind of make over this gap. And I think one way in which we can improve sort of native species within these small connected patches is by sowing and by choosing our species carefully, ones that can handle the heat, ones that can self-disperse. And then what you do is you sow these seeds, and you select these species, and you try to promote the types of. We built a city that does really, really well with dandelion, and then we wonder and we scratch our heads, why is there dandelion everywhere? I mean, the types of spaces we create are great for dandelion. If you can give other species kind of a leg up, I think you can really work towards doing that, and it will be active. There are certainly neophytes that do great in cities from Italy, let's say, especially as Zurich heats up. But I think there are ways to sort of give other species a leg up through intentional design, I would say, and then allowing them to grow and creating enough space that they can actually send their seeds along and not have everything way too far apart that only Taraxacum seeds can get there.
Sort of in the same vein, I have a question or maybe a comment. Thinking about these seed bombs and sort of like this human selected conservation. These seed bombs are beautiful pollinator important flowers, but they're showy and maybe aesthetically pleasing. How can we maybe preserve some of these less showy but ecologically important species that are persisting and remnant in the cities, like the amaranths and the other less showy plants?
I mean, I think this is certainly tough. I think it's easy to have these charismatic megaflora that are I purposely for some of my work focused on sort of a beautiful wildflower. It's actually a problem in the United States, but in Europe it's native because for the exact reason that it is showy, Centrea Yatzia, and people like it, and so people want to support it. For those that aren't, I think a big part of it is simply getting people on board through actually kind of talking to them and showing them like the importance of this. I was just at actually a bee talk. It was a talk for people who were working on beehives within the city. They were urban beekeepers. And it was very interesting, a very kind of intense talk at some point between people, wild bees and honeybees and the economy of trying to raise bees in the cities and their needs. But something that I thought was really amazing was there was a stand with a ton of wildflowers for pollinators, and these were almost entirely native, and a lot of them actually weren't super duper showy, but what they were was there was a lot of information about sort of what role these play within the system, what role, like, for instance, we took home a couple that, like, I mean, they're biennial, so that, this year they're going to look like nothing. They're going to, for anyone looking at them, they look like a weed, and next year they're going to have nice flowers, but I mean, they aren't, roses. I think a lot of it comes down to sort of engaging with the public in that regard, or creating spaces where these things can grow. I think not every rooftop garden needs to be, heavily sown with the most beautiful flowers and stuff like this. A lot of these spaces can be, or a lot of rural spaces as well, can be reserved in some way for some of these species that might not be the most beautiful.
Thank you. We have a raised hand. I don't know if it's Ira or Ira, but you can totally unmute yourself and.
I guess can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I have a comment. I like the idea of identifying plants growing in cracks. There's a place near me called Ellington in the Park. I saw a tomato plant growing out of a crack and a few other things. And I'm just concerned that if we start chalking up the identities of these plants, we might get attention drawn to them and get lopped. So it's a mixed bag, I think.
For sure.
And also, going back to the idea of pavements, of permeable pavement, there's so many different types of permeable pavement. And I was at an ashram up in the Catskills, and I had to Google to find out what the damn stuff was. They were using what I would call steel grid pavers through their parking lot.
Uh-huh.
And I'd never heard of them before. I'd never seen them before, but they must last a long time, I imagine. They're probably very easy to put down. You can throw them down in mud, and they do a good job. So I'd like to see, and also up near Alley Pond Park, there were some more pavement, permeable pavement, kind of what you were showing. Yeah, so I'll cede my hand.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a lot of like opportunities to create spaces for people to walk, or less so wonderfully, but cars to park that aren't just absolute asphalt from corner to corner with massive amounts of runoff problems. I think there's certainly a lot of ways that these issues can be done, and I'm sure an engineer will explain to me why that is. It can't work everywhere, and I'm fine with that. I'm not an engineer, but certainly we don't need absolutely every place a human's going to put their foot down to be absolutely and completely sealed.
Oh, we're getting some raised hands. We also have tons of comments in the questions in the comment section. Jill wants to know, do people in Zurich know about the amazing stories of what has happened in our American cities, such as New York and Chicago wilderness?
So, I know about it, but I'm pretty well connected to American urban ecologists. I would say that the average person probably does not think very much about the nature in cities, in American cities outside of, say, like Central Park or something like that, Golden Gate Park, let's say, I think sort of I would say the average person probably has not heard very much about these things of the great strides a lot of these cities have made in these last years. The urban ecologists, on the other hand, that I've worked with certainly have heard about them. Like the High Lines, everyone's heard of the High Line. Okay, so like that made it over here. Don't worry, people are also deciding like, oh, you know what we need? We need to build an elevated railway park rather than try to like. It's a problem here too. They're like, yeah, this is the answer. But other than like the High Line, I will say that certain things haven't really like gotten over here to the to the degree that I wish they did. Specifically, I think a question about the green equality, sort of access to green spaces within cities. I find that much more in the literature within the United States than I do within like European circles and discussions about that, where it's still a little bit more centered on heat island and a focus on more of the just pure sort of like ecology and sort of creation of green space in that regard, outside of course the School of Barcelona, which has done a lot on green equality, which is wonderful, and it's coming, but yeah, I would say overall they probably haven't heard that much, but I don't know how much of you guys heard about Zurich. Probably not very much. Yeah.
Now we have.
Yeah.
Now we're experts. Alrighty. Molly, if you want to ask your question, you can go right ahead.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. This is great. Listen, you use the word volunteer fairly often, and I suspect you mean volunteerism oriented mostly towards the community science and the engagement building.
Yeah.
I suspect you're not talking about helping to maintain those plots in some way. Like you talked about keeping neat and trimming things and stuff like that, but curious.
Yeah. No. So I would say the benefit in some ways that so Zurich sometimes has a problem that it has rather than too little too much money, in the sense that like it does a little bit too much work to clean up from the top down. I know of like the ways in which it sometimes is done certainly in some American cities where a green space is kind of stewarded by a person. They volunteer, and so you create a green space and then you place an additional labor upon the person who who's living there to maintain these spaces. And generally, as far as I've ever seen within Zurich, this has not been the case. The only time that ever happens is when a person illegally takes control of one of these spaces as sort of an act of like public defiance, I suppose, and then plants something there or tries to do something within this space. I find it a really interesting phenomenon. But and then they kind of take stewardship over this. But when I'm talking about volunteers within my sort of community science work, that is simply people who join us to help with these projects. They don't really there's no maintenance or anything with these spaces. That's all done by the city, for good and for ill.
Thank you.
All right. There's a couple other of the questions in here are kind of asking about this kind of the public engagement stuff. Jack, I guess this was the question you had your hand raised for that you typed in here, that on Roosevelt Island, working on creating small patches and corridors, but there are lots of different invasives, and how, so when you're educating the community in Zurich, how do you approach these kind of invasives? Are there a lot of, do you see similar things that we see in New York City where there's these invasives that will kind of just take over complete areas?
Sure. Switzerland spends a lot of money dealing with invasives. The best is when they place something on the blacklist and then they'll spend a whole bunch of money getting rid of it, and yet that same plant is being sold in a garden warehouse down the street. People are spending tons of money to go and rip them out, and you can volunteer to do this as well, and this would actually be voluntary stewardship. But there is a very strong push against invasives. We have slightly different. Certainly, the Japanese knotweed is a problem. There's other species that are quite invasive within urban areas within Switzerland. The tree of heaven, Alientis, is certainly one of them that you see. You see it in the Bronx for sure. You see it in all across the East Coast that I've been to, and certainly you see it in Zurich as well, all over the place. And for some of these species, it's somewhat more hands off. Like, the tree of heaven, I don't think they deal with as much as they do with some of these much more intense invasives. But this is certainly a problem. And this is, to me, it's one of the hardest things that you deal with, because as sort of as an ecologist, I'm somewhat as an urban ecologist, I guess I'm somewhat of a rebel against some of my colleagues in that I think, neophytes, I think, like non-native species, have a role to play within cities as urbanization changes the landscape into a novel ecosystem. To believe that the plants that could once exist within the forested landscape surrounding Zurich are now the best species to put on the middle of the center of the city that is massively hot and extremely dry, I think is somewhat silly. And I think to look not like to plants that can survive there is to basically be like, well, then what are we going to do? I mean, you could keep planting every year the exact same tree and it's going to die, and then you're going to have to pull it up and plant it again because you like there's not much of an option. But invasives are another story, and the ways in which you deal with them are the same ways you deal with them in the States. You spend money to have people pull them up, and you attempt to decontaminate soil when you can. It's perhaps not as large a problem as far as the areas I've seen, but people have put a lot of money on them.
And that's a great comment that you make about non-natives, that I think people a lot of times will assume that non-native equals invasive, when in fact, things have been moving around for millions of years. And in some sense, is that kind of resiliency of things kind of, and range shifts and things moving around. There is another comment / question here from Ken about the pollinators. That bees of course are very charismatic and are perhaps the most hardworking, but there's lots of other less sexy perhaps pollinators, and if you have any plans on including those about flies, wasps, etc.
So we're keeping track of all of that. Certainly, where our focus is on bees. Butterflies, people would love to do more on, but unfortunately, they're much less common, honestly, in terms of what we're able to actually sit and take a picture of and identify for the purposes of this. So our focus is largely on bees. But I mean, yeah, absolutely. Hoverflies are, we're noting down, hoverflies and other species of fly. We're noting down our wasps. And so, on that list, you can see this breakdown because these, while not necessarily carrying the exact same load of pollination that perhaps, bees taken as an entire group do, they are massively important. And, different species have different pollinators. And there are some species, one of the species that I love a lot, Hippocaris radicata, which I also did work on, specifically, is a lot of hoverfly pollinated. And so I think, a lot of the focus is on bees. I'm happy that it's starting to broaden out to wild bees also. And I'm hoping that we can, kind of continue this process of understanding the importance of pollination within these areas and the roles that, flies and hoverflies and wasps also play.
Awesome. Well, glad that you guys are looking at those ones too. And the last comment that we have in here from Allison says, it's interesting when people study animals in wild spaces. Generally, the smaller spaces are less helpful to the animals because of all of the edges. But this seems to be with the plants the opposite. And in fact, I guess those edges may then actually be working in the opposite, like for the plants instead. I wonder if you have any comments on that. I see Tomi just popped something in there about arthropods, etc.
Yeah. So edge effects are certainly something that is very important. And certainly I think will play a role. I think that comes down to the sort of resiliency and why it's so important that these are connected, because at some level they begin, when they're well connected, they act as sort of like a mega patch rather than individuals, because they're actually able to sort of the pollination continues between them. They are genetically connected in that way, and also seed dispersal can connect them. But and this is why I try to stress, as much as I'm talking about, small patches punching above their weight, it's an incredibly sort of temperamental system when you are that small. The edge effects can immediately wipe you out. I mean, one burst pipe, let's say, and your small patch is completely flooded. Large patches have the resiliency to handle dramatic changes, and they're also much more likely to be able to retain these rare and important species. So certainly edge effects, I think, can play a role when you look at it on the whole. My point really was that, similar to arthropods, they're able to kind of be connected. They're able to survive within smaller spaces. Certainly, they're not like a wolf or something like that. But I imagine that, if you really broke it down and look at it, an individual plant, it is more likely to die if it's in a small patch than if it's in a big patch. But taken as a whole, when we're talking about sort of the beta diversity of the city, my point was largely these small patches are playing a really important role in supporting that. Yeah, but I always am ready for the edge effect question, because it's true. Yeah, just less so for something like that. Yeah, as Tommy said.
Thank you, Kevin, so much for coming and speaking with us. I think that you had a lot of really great points and things to think about. And hopefully, with kind of things like our project, that we can continue to engage the people who are, the biggest kind of stakeholders in all of this, to have them, know what's there and why it's important, why it matters. It's a very important work.
Thank you very much.
So thanks everyone for coming. Stay tuned. We have that walk on Thursday. We'll have some more of them coming up. And next month, we actually have 2 lectures scheduled, one in the beginning of the month and one in the end. And we're starting a little mini series on plant-insect interactions. So we've got a talk coming up with ants, and one with spiders, one with bees. So this has been our lead-in into that, with a little bit of that. And so everybody stay well, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for listening. Have a great evening. I'm going to go to bed. Ciao.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.